I'm talking about capital and interest theory. Now, to warn you, it is a difficult topic, and so in this lecture, I'm going to try to cater to both groups because there's some of you here that your professor loves Austrian Economics and they sent you here, and you're just learning what it is for the first time. So obviously we have to go through the basics. On the other hand, there's people here that since they were 8 years old, they've known human action back and forth, and to be honest, it gets a little bit intimidating. Every year the questions get more and more intense, and to the point where you have an 8-year-old saying, "But Mises on page 15 said this," but then Rothbard in the third edition said this, and that's when I say, "Yeah, my wife's calling. I gotta go." So what I'll do in this, I'll try to be clear when I go off on a slightly technical digression, because I do want to cater to both groups. So I hope be clear as to what's the standard basic stuff that you really need to come away with. In other sections, I'll try to be clear that I'll say that this is a bit more advanced, because I know many of you have been reading this stuff and you know it, and you don't just want to hear us repeat the same old thing that you already read. So let me go through this menu here. Okay, and I got to do. Yep. Okay, great. And let me just cover this up. Okay, you guys can see that? All right. So the standard definition of what's a capital good is that it's a produced means of production. And so let's break that up a little bit. So it's in two components, right? So the produced part is pretty obvious. It means produced as opposed to just existing in nature. All right. So capital goods is distinct from labor or a natural resource. All right, so the other two, labor and land, are not produced; they already exist in nature, whereas the capital goods produced. And then, as far as a means of production, what they mean is as opposed to a means of consumption, or as opposed to a consumption good. Okay, so a capital good, again, this is the standard definition you get in a regular textbook probably, is that it's something that humans produce, but there's a further qualification that it's something that's going to be used for further production, right? So you can make a chicken sandwich at a restaurant, and so that certainly has been produced. It's not that it occurs naturally; it is produced. Or make a television set would be probably a better example. But yet, that's not necessarily a capital good. It depends on if it's going to be used for production or consumption. Okay. Now, even there. And then I hand wrote it, so that's a subjective if it's not coming through to you, especially people downstairs. What I want to stress is it's not an objective fact of the matter. It's not that you can just look at something and know from its physical characteristics, is this a capital good or a consumption good? Ultimately, at least if you're an Austrian economist, everything has to relate to the subjective intentions of the agent or the actor. So to give you a couple silly examples, if you've got a guy on a street corner and he's just sitting there with a guitar strumming it, and he's just playing it to amuse himself, then, maybe he got the guitar from his parents at one point, and he's just sitting on the corner playing the guitar, would be a consumption good if he's just doing it for his own enjoyment, just like if somebody had a Game Boy or whatever you crazy kids play nowadays, that would be a consumption good, okay? But if people are walking by and they really like the music, and they start throwing money into the guy's hat that he happens to have there, right, then it might turn into a production, or a capital good, if now he's going to be using it, so now he's viewing the guitar not as something to be enjoyed, but rather as a means to earning money. Okay, so he's using it for the production of entertainment services for passersby. Okay, so you can see the same physical thing could switch, and it's not because something in the molecules of the guitar change, it's only because of the subjective intentions of the guy sitting there playing it, okay? A different example, if you imagine the diary of Anne Frank, right? So when she was the actual girl with the diary, that was just, she's recording her experiences, that was a consumption good, right? But then when that thing got into the hands of a publisher, they realized, oh my gosh, if we reproduce the contents of this, we'll make a bunch of money selling books, and so that physical thing would now be a capital good, because it's, the person didn't want it for his own direct enjoyment or satisfaction. He wanted it as a means to an end. Okay, so just be careful. There's a tendency a lot of times when you talk about capital goods, that people think that it has to do with the physical nature of the object. That, a capital good is something like a tractor, whereas a consumption good is something like a steak dinner, when no, the same physical thing could be one or the other depending on what the subjective intentions are. Now let me make this point, and this is a little bit of a technical point, so if you lose me a little bit here, it's okay. But strictly speaking, from the Austrian point of view, it's not so much whether something was produced by human beings that makes it eligible to be a capital good. And the reason I want to go over this is not so much because of the difference between the standard definition and what somebody like Rothbard put in his introduction to Frank Fetter's essays on capital and rent and interest. Rothbard stresses this, and he said, actually, it's not so much that it's something that's been produced, it's that it's reproducible, and it's a means of production. All right, so as far as reconciling with Austrian theory, why am I bringing this up? Because if you think about it, every other aspect of Austrian theory, the lectures you've heard so far today, it has to do with, yes, subjectivism, which I've stressed, but also it's forward-looking, right? That the actor takes the world as it is right now and then has plans based on the future, and that's the basis of action. That what happened in the past isn't really relevant except in the sense that it has influenced what the situation is right now. And so it would be a little bit weird if the Austrian theory had as a definition of a capital good, you had to know the history of a certain item, right? So that if I gave you an object and said, as an Austrian economist, do you think this is a capital good or a consumption good or a natural given factor of production, like a piece of land or a nature, it would be a little bit weird to have to say, well, we need to know what the life history of this thing is. And so let me give you a contrived example to show you what I mean. You can imagine if you're looking at some tribe somewhere that lives in the jungle, and they make spears, right? So they're hunting game, and they take branches, and then they sharpen it, and they bring it to a point, and then they go out and they throw the spears at the animals, and that's how they get their food. But then suppose for some reason, there's a lightning storm, it hits a branch, it falls, and then maybe some beavers or something work on it, and some guy's walking through the forest, and he sees something, it's a nature-given factor, but yet it's almost identical to the type of spear that his tribe would spend hours normally fashioning, right? So it would be a little bit awkward for us to have to say, oh no, that isn't a capital good because nature produced it. That's land, whereas this other spear is a capital good because we know our tribe produced it, right? And then if you switched them around and said, oh, where'd the capital good go, right? That would be a little bit, right? So that's like I said, if you're familiar with the Austrian approach to things, that it would be odd if you had to keep track of the history of something. And this goes to, critiques of the cost theory of production and so forth, that the historical origin of something shouldn't matter. So Rothbard's approach deals with that issue. That's why I was saying it's reproducible. So that thing that the beavers worked on or whatever, it would be a capital good because the idea is once that thing, once you used it and it got broken or bloody or whatever and they couldn't use it anymore, the idea is they could make another one. They could go find another branch, work on it, and make another one. So the idea is it would be classified as a capital good because using what's called the original factors of production, namely human labor and nature-given factors, the raw wood and the raw human manpower, they could create more of these things. They wouldn't have to just wait and hope that there's another freak lightning bolt and then the beavers work on it in just the right way. Okay? All right. Now here is again a fairly technical point. You might wonder, and some people do bring this up, and they say, okay, fine, you have this distinction, but why do you even care? Why are you going to the trouble of distinguishing labor from capital goods or distinguishing nature-given factors from capital goods? What's the point? As you Austrians yourselves explained, that the explanation of the rental price of something and how much a productive factor earns on the marketplace, it's the same apparatus you use. And we'll see this a little bit later, and I think Jeff Herbner's lecture, he went over this with you. But when I'm trying to explain how much a worker receives per hour for selling his labor, or if I'm trying to explain how much somebody who owns a tractor can earn by the hour renting it out to somebody, or a landowner if he wants to rent a parcel of land every month to somebody, to try to explain how much money they get, what's the price of those factors of production, it's the same explanation that the Austrian gives, right? It has to do with subjective valuations and physical productivity, but it doesn't matter what type of factor of production it is. So a lot of times people will say, well, so why are you going to the trouble of distinguishing these things? And the technical reason, and again, this is as a technical point, if you get confused here, don't worry, this isn't crucial, but it's because in the Austrian framework, in the evenly rotating economy, or what's called the ERE, capital goods earn gross rent but not net rent. And so it's only labor and natural resources that earn net rent. And so what I mean here is that if somebody, this tribe, let's say, that's making these spears, you couldn't in the long run be earning a net profit on making those spears, right? That it would the revenue you're getting from selling the spears to people who want to use them would get imputed back to the labor and land factors and also the time element. And we'll get into this later in the lecture right now. Okay, but the point is that in the long run, there would not be some specific return going to the spear per se. To the spear manufacturer would not be getting a specific return, and more generally, people who produce capital goods in the evenly rotating economy, when everything settles down and there's no uncertainty, when you're trying to trace back, okay, how much are consumers spending on certain goods, and you trace back the payments to specific factors, there's no return that's going to capital goods that isn't in turn being divvied out among the original factors, and also to the capitalists for their time element. Okay, so that's why, in case you step back and say, okay, well, why are we bothering to make this distinction? That's why. Okay, another important distinction that Mises would stress a lot is the difference between capital goods versus just capital. And so he's pretty good about, in his work, to be clear, where if there's any danger of confusion, that he clarifies, and he'll say capital goods if he's referring to the physical things that are produced or reproducible means of production, versus just the word capital. That is a different term, and mainstream writers a lot of times use the two interchangeably, and it leads to all sorts of trouble especially in terms of policy analysis. So we already know what capital goods are. For Mises, if he's just talking about capital, what he means is financial capital. And that's the sum of the money prices for assets related to an enterprise minus the financial obligations. All right, so give you an example. If I open a laundromat, I have money that I've saved, and then I go and I buy some dryers, and I buy the heavy duty washing machines and those vending machines that have the single serve dryer sheets and laundry detergent and so forth. My business has plenty of capital goods in it, right? I can point to those things. They're reproducible. They're means of production. So they're capital goods. But if somebody says to me, hey, how much capital do you have invested in your business? They don't want me to list all of the different machines and other, components, the physical attributes of it. What they mean is give me a number, meaning how much of your money is at risk in this enterprise. Or if I, report what my revenues are, and then my cost of, the money cost of production, someone might say, okay, well, how much capital do you have invested? Because they want to figure out what's the rate of return on me running this business. So what they mean when they use that word capital is, again, they're referring to a monetary concept. They want me to say, if I sold off the business, what would I have left over after I paid off any creditors that I had? All right, so it's, the two are intimately related in a market economy through the prices of the capital goods. In order for you to figure out how much capital is in a particular enterprise, one of the main things you have to do is figure out if I sold all these machines, all these capital goods, and keep in mind, capital goods aren't just the machines. It would also be the goods in process. So if you're a grocery store, the capital goods in the enterprise aren't just, the dollies that they have, or the forklifts that the guys in the grocery part use to, lift the boxes up, if you've ever seen that, or in the dairy department, the glass cases that are refrigerated to keep the milk in. So those things are all capital goods, but also the food itself, like the boxes of cereal and the milk and so forth. From the grocery store owner's point of view, those things are also capital goods, right? Because they're not ordering 300 gallons of milk to have a big party with, right? That'd be a pretty boring party, right? So those things are also capital goods. So again, and this is also a very Austrian flavor or spin, is capital goods are not simply the fixed machinery. Again, a little technical digression for those of you who are studying graduate economics. The distinction there is between what's called fixed capital, so that means like the heavy machinery, versus what's called circulating capital, and that would refer to the stuff like the boxes of cereal that they put on the shelves and then they quickly cycle through. Or if you're in a bakery, the fixed capital would be the oven, that, millions of or thousands of loaves of bread go through the oven and come out the other end, whereas the flour would be part of the circulating capital. Okay, that the flour, quickly goes through the process and is used up, whereas the oven kind of sits there and contributes, in a sense, 1/1000th of itself to a loaf of bread as it goes through, because the oven deteriorates or depreciates over time. Okay, so that's a lot of mainstream economists, when they're talking about capital, they're thinking in terms of what's really just fixed capital, whereas the Austrians, a lot of times they have in mind the broader notion, which includes what's called circulating capital, the goods in process. So things that are moving from the wholesale stage down to the retail stage, those goods in process are also capital goods, and a lot of other schools of thought don't even deal with those, whereas the Austrians deal with them in particular. Okay, so again, just be careful when you use the term capital. It could mean one thing or the other, and really what you want to be careful about is to switch it in the middle of an argument. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't give you a good example of that, but I have read arguments, mainstream economists arguing with Austrians, and part of what happens is the mainstream economists will use the same term capital for both concepts, and will flip in the middle of the argument, and so that's why the argument goes astray, is because they've been talking about one thing and then they start talking about something else. Okay, last little historical curiosity on this page is that Marx, in using the term capitalism to describe a free market economic system, he meant that as a smear. Because if you think about it, we're all trained that when, the word socialism to sort of induce nausea, but if you didn't know any of the history about it, what's socialism, and contrasting it with capitalism? Well, Marx chose those terms because he was trying to say, look, capitalism is an economic system that just favors this narrow group of capitalists. So it's a system for the capitalists, let's call it capitalism, whereas socialism favors all of society. So it's socialism, right? So that's, and Marx is just in general very good about picking terminology, and it's always hard to win those arguments. To give you a different example, I work for the Institute for Energy Research, and now the big debate is over, types of energy, and they keep switching it. So before, I'm sure you all know this, it used to be global warming, then they changed it to climate change. And why they did that? Because temperatures stayed flat for 5 years in a row, so they said, well, we can't come with that. And now, they used to talk about, renewable energy, and they got away from that a little bit, and I think part of it is because they didn't want hydropower to count, because it kills fish or something. So, but clearly water is renewable, and so now the new term that they use is clean energy, right? So they're for clean energy. So then by default, I'm for dirty energy, right? So I'm for the capitalists so they can make money producing dirty energy, right? So there's no way, we can win except to point out, how many millions of people die under the other system. Okay, so, anyway, that's just a historical curiosity that term capitalism was intended as a smear, but as Mises points out, it actually isn't a bad term. So it's wrong in that it thinks, or if it's suggesting that capitalism only helps the capitalists, that no, as we know, the free market economy showers untold riches on everybody, and that if you're a very poor person, you want to be in a true free market economy. That's where you're going to get the highest price for your labor, and that you're going to be able to succeed if you work hard and save. Whereas if you're a relatively powerless, poor person, the last thing in the world you want to be is in a totalitarian society, especially if you're in an ethnic minority. The last thing in the world you want to be is a society where the majority installs a government with police, strong police powers. But Mises says, so it's not true that capitalism is an accurate term, meaning that it picks the narrow group of capitalists, but he said it is important that really is the essence of what happens in a market economy. It really stresses the importance of capital. and that in this, I think Joe Salerno may do the lecture on the critique of socialism, and you'll see there that the problem of calculation, he'll go over it more fully with you at that point, but the idea is that market prices for capital goods, the means of production, are really important in terms of steering production decisions in a market economy. And so Mises says actually Marx ironically came up with a pretty good name for what goes on in a market economy. Okay. All right, so let me now talk a little bit about the classical approach, and this will help you, I think, to see where the modern Austrian approach differs from it and where they're coming from. So, to be clear, this is wrong. So, this is the erroneous classical understanding, but you'll see it still survives in modern vocabulary. So, on the left-hand column, we've got the factors of production, what's called land, but again, it's a more general concept. It's not just actual, natural land. It's also things like deposits of diamonds or coal, or if there's some spring that gives out water that people want to bottle and sell, that water would be called land in this classification. So gifts from nature, and then labor, which means to them what it means to us, and what they would call capital, but we'll call capital goods. All right, and then they assigned it to a type of income. So in the classical approach, you say, what is rent? They'd say, rent is the income that land earns. And you say, well, what's wages? They'd say, that's the payment that's made to labor, and profit or interest, because they use those terms somewhat interchangeably. And that's going to be a distinction that I think you'll learn later on in a different lecture. But the classical economists would often use profit or interest interchangeably, meaning, how much, when a business person sells the product, how much money do they get over and above the money they paid out for the inputs? So that's what the classical economists meant by, and they might call it profit or they call it interest. And they say, what is that? They say, that's the return to capital. All right, and you still see this a lot. Obviously, wages, we still use that term for what's paid to labor. And rent, most people think rent is what you pay to your landlord. So if you think of it that way, that somebody, what's your rent this month? People aren't going to think you mean that what's your factor of production and what's the marginal productivity. They're going to think how much is your check to your landlord if you have an apartment. All right, so you can still see some of the vestiges of this thinking. So this is wrong, and this is a neat little example of how you can have an economic explanation that really you can tell something's wrong with it. So it's not that I'm going to need to go look up statistics and show you, this led to a bad prediction. We can instead just think it through and realize that you're going to hit contradictions if this is the way you're trying to analyze the world. And so that's why the classical approach, among its other flaws, isn't really a good way of looking at the world. All right, and so this just more generally is how work advances in economics, even if it's an a priori science. All right, and that you already had Hoppe's lecture on praxeology? Okay, so this is an example, because a lot of people will say, well, gee, if it's just all in your head, and it's all just you're spinning out definitions, then it's not scientific, how do you ever progress? Well, here's an example. I'm going to show you what's wrong with this approach, and again, it's not because I'm going to go measure something. I'm just going to show you, if you think about it, this isn't very helpful. So, Irving Fisher actually pointed this out, so I'll just read this in case you can't see it. So Irving Fisher's counterexample: suppose a capitalist spends $100,000 on a parcel of arable land and rents it out for $5,000 per year to tenant farmers. Are these annual payments rent, because they're a payment for the use of land, or are they interest, because it's a return on the invested capital? All right, so again, if let's say you had $100,000 that you had saved up, you can go buy a bond that pays 5% interest. So what does that mean? It means you hand over the $100,000 to the government or the corporation. They give you this bond, and then every year they pay you $5,000. So clearly you're earning a 5% return on your money there. That's clearly interest. Everybody would agree. Classical, Adam Smith would agree. Yeah, because you had $100,000 in capital and you lent it out and you're earning payment on it, and so it's the return to capital. That's clearly interest, 5%. But what I'm saying is, what Fisher was saying is, well, what if you took that $100,000, bought a piece of land that's arable, it's productive, and so tenant farmers, they don't own the land, but they want to work the land, and you say, okay, I'll let you grow your crops here, you can keep whatever you want, but you charge them so much every month, let's say, and it adds up to $5,000 per year is what they're paying you for the right to use your land. So they're not buying the land from you, they're renting it. And so clearly, according to that table, that's rent that they're giving you. If payment for the use of land isn't rent, then I don't know what is. You're the landlord, you're the absentee landlord perhaps, and you're getting $5,000 per year on your $100,000 of financial capital. So that's clearly also a 5% return on the interest rate, or a 5% interest rate return. Okay, so that's what I'm showing, that it's wrong to think of it in terms of the difference between rent and interest is money going to one type of activity versus another, or one type of person versus another. That's not really helpful, because you just cases like this where it's quite clear it's both at the same time. All right, so that's not the right way to think about it. Okay, similar thing, you could do it also with labor. So I say a southern example, and I'm kidding because it's not like the South is pro-slavery, but suppose a plantation owner spends $100,000 on slaves and rents them out for $5,000 annually. Again, using that classical distinction, you would say, the person that's renting the slave, he's paying for labor, and of course, the labor payment's not going to the slave, it's going to the owner, but clearly those are payments for labor, so that should be a wage, and yet at the same time, it's an interest return on the invested capital. So, again, just to show you, if you have this idea that the type of factor that something is, that determines what its payment is, you're going to run into all these contradictions. All right, so it's not a good explanation. So the proper explanation, I'm not going to dwell on it too much, so just to be clear, so this is bad. All right, so make sure you don't walk out of here and saying, the one thing I took away was that table and then I lost them. All right? Okay. So that's wrong, but I'm trying to, yeah. All right, so very, very briefly here, this isn't the focus of what I'm talking about, but just to make sure I don't leave you hanging. So how does the Austrian explain these things? That any productive factor earns what's called the discounted marginal revenue product, and you don't have to write. This isn't going to be part of the quiz for my lecture. Other people are talking about this, but I just want to finish this train of thought for you. So it's something based on its how much extra revenue you get if you hire one more unit of the factor, whether it's a labor factor or a land factor or a capital good. The entrepreneur says, well, how much more revenue can I get if I hire one more unit? So that's the marginal revenue product. And then really what they do, if that revenue is not going to accrue until the future, then it's the discounted marginal revenue product, because they take the time element into account. If I'm going to hire somebody and he's going to work on something that I'm not going to be able to sell for 10 years, and it's going to bring me in an additional $10 10 years from now, that's different from the case where if I hire him, he's going to bring me an additional $10 10 minutes from now, right? So you got to take the time element into account. So productive factors earn the discounted marginal revenue product regardless of whether they're land, labor, or a capital good. And then, the interest return is built in there because of this time discount factor. And this will be a little bit clearer as we go on. Okay, so again, the point is that interest is not a payment that goes to a certain type of factor. Everything gets rent. That workers, in a sense, are renting out their bodies. So wages are a form of a rent that labor earns. So every productive factor gets a rental payment. But if that rental payment doesn't accrue until the future, what you do is what's called capitalizing those things. So a piece of land, you say, I can rent this thing out at $5,000 per year indefinitely. How much should you pay for it? What the entrepreneur does is say, okay, I can get $5,000 this year, $5,000 next year, but I'm going to discount that because it's 1 year later. And then they do that, and so I pay $100,000 right now. So that $100,000 is the discounted flow of these future rental payments that the land would give you. All right. So again, I'm going quickly over there, but I just want to not knock this down and move on. I want to show you how the Austrian deals with it. Okay. Now, I think the best way to explain the Austrian approach to interest is to give you, to sort of approach it historically the way that Böhm-Bawerk did. So, I think Guido Hulsmann in his opening lecture Sunday night alluded to this, but let me reiterate it. So Karl Menger was, and if you take a regular history of economic thought class, you'll see this, that Karl Menger was one of the three people credited with the subjectivist marginalist revolution. And what Böhm-Bawerk basically did was take those subjectivist marginalist insights and apply it to capital and interest theory. All right, and you'll see in a few minutes how that all plays out. But that's what Böhm-Bawerk basically did, is he took Menger's approach to explaining the prices of different present goods. So Menger's approach would explain, why does steak sell for more than hamburgers, or why do diamonds right now sell for a higher price than water? So Menger could explain that, and then the framework he developed, Böhm-Bawerk, his student, took that framework and then applied it to issues involving the delay of time or the elapsing of time. And that's where interest comes into play, as we'll see in Böhm-Bawerk's framework. All right, so the interest problem, the way Böhm-Bawerk defined it, is the following. And obviously, with all these things, when I'm putting in nice round numbers, it's not that Irving Fisher was using 100,000 and neither was Böhm-Bawerk. Okay, so he says, suppose a capitalist can spend $100,000 on land, labor, and capital goods, and 1 year later, the finished product can be sold for $110,000. So how can this apparent undervaluation of the factors persist? All right, so that's the problem for Böhm-Bawerk, is that, so when he's approaching interest, he wasn't looking at the bond market. He wasn't saying, why is it that when I lend out $1,000, I get $1,100 paid back the next year? That's not the way he viewed it. He thought interest rates set in the bond market were subordinate to what he called originary interest. So let me write that phrase down. Okay, so originary interest is the term, the translated term of what Böhm-Bawerk meant by interest that you earn, if you will, by participating in the capital goods markets, right? That you go in and you buy factors of production, you mix them according to some technological recipe, you produce a good that you then sell after the passage of time, and typically you get more for the thing you made and sell in the future than what you had to pay out. And it's true, for random isolated incidents, you could just say, well, it's because there was a freak thing or it was a fluke. But clearly this seems to be a regular phenomenon in market economies, that entrepreneurs spend less total money on all the inputs that they use than they get in total revenues when they turn around and sell the thing to their customers. And so Böhm-Bawerk's question is, why should that happen? Because if you didn't know that was already the case from experience, if you're just sitting in your armchair reasoning it through, you would probably think that the prices of the inputs should get bid up to reflect the full expected sale price of the output, right? That if you know you can make this product with these various inputs, and that the product's going to sell for $110,000, wouldn't competition among producers bid up the prices of those factors to $110,000 or $109,999 or whatever, right? And that's actually, we use that type of argument as free market economists to explain why labor's not exploited, right? We say as long as there's competition, if somebody's worth $100 an hour, typically that's what they're going to get paid in the long run, right? That if one employer is only paying them $50 an hour, we'd say, well, shouldn't some other employer see that and offer him 60, and then someone offers him 70 until his wage gets up to, what he's contributing to the bottom line. So that same process, why isn't that happening here? So that's, for Böhm-Bawerk, what the interest problem was, what the economists had to explain in order to solve, or to explain interest in the market economy. Okay. So there's a diagram just to make sure. All right, and we'll come back to this in a bit, but I'm just putting the diagram there, what I already said in words. Okay. So, now don't get confused here. The naive productivity theory is wrong, and this is one of the theories Böhm-Bawerk critiqued. All right, so I meant to grab it and I forgot. Böhm-Bawerk has this big volume, and there's a few copies circulating here at the Mises Institute of essays on capital and interest. And his first volume is, I think, called A History and Critique of Theories of Interest. So in the first volume, he lays out the problem, like I just explained, and then he just catalogs all the previous writers on it and explains why, this guy says this, and no, that's wrong. And this guy says this, and no, that's wrong. And it's actually, he gives a taxonomy, right? That he has to, he classifies them all. He's like a biologist and puts them in all the different categories of varying degrees of error in his mind. And it incidentally, I would encourage you, it's an intimidating book, but it's really funny. You have to have a sort of weird sense of humor. But, let me put it this way, like Mises is very gentle with his opponents compared to what Böhm-Bawerk does to the people he takes on. Right, so Mises was a student in a sense of Böhm-Bawerk, so I think Mises probably thought he was being a real nice guy compared to, he's like, you think I'm mean, you should read Eugen. Alright, so let's go through this because it'll be helpful. And this is probably, in terms of, how are the Austrians different when it comes to capital theory compared to the mainstream, it's dealing with this issue right here that we're going to talk about for the next 10 minutes. That, either labels you as, okay, you get it, you're a good Austrian, or if you're a mainstream economist, say those Austrians are crazy. These guys, they don't understand the first thing about capital theory. Okay, so the naive productivity theory explains this interest problem and says, the reason that systematically, as a general rule, entrepreneurs can spend a certain amount of money on inputs to create a product, then turn around and sell that product for more money than they spent in the collective on all those inputs. The reason they can do that is because capital is productive. Alright, so that explanation that I put in quotation marks there, that is the naive productivity theory in Böhm-Bawerk's framework, and he destroyed it. Okay, so, but let me just try to give the theory, its due here. Say, after all, you can build a bigger or better house by using hammers, saws, pre-cut 2x4s, etc. So why wouldn't you earn an extra return from buying these inputs? Or a different example, if you're thinking in terms of agriculture, the naive productivity theorists would say something like, okay, well, what are we trying to explain? We're trying to explain why is it that if I spend $100,000 on fertilizer and books that teach me the best irrigation techniques and I buy a tractor and so forth, why is it that I can grow more crops and sell them and earn more than $100,000 extra from buying all these inputs than if I just tried to farm using my bare hands in rainfall? Right? So it seems obvious that, the answer is because the tractor's physically productive, that knowledge is valuable, the irrigation techniques are productive, the fertilizer's productive, okay? So that's the idea. It seems totally obvious that, it's because the stuff's productive. That's why you get more value coming out the other end, and you can sell it for more than you had to pay for it. So Böhm-Bawerk says no, that's nonsense. How can productivity explain the undervaluation? All right, so it's not merely that this theory doesn't quite work. It's this theory on the face of it is absurd. So if we go back to this diagram here, remember what we're trying to explain in this specific case of a house is we're trying to say why is it that the inputs, the saws and the hammer and the nails and the 2x4s and whatever, the workers that I hired, the masons and so on, why is it that I only had to pay $100,000 when I know I'm going to be able to sell that house a year later for $110,000? And it doesn't make any sense to say, the reason that there's this $10,000 undervaluation is because the hammer is very productive or these workers are really well trained and that's why. Right? That doesn't make any sense. The Böhm-Bawerk says you would think to cite the productivity of these factors would be a reason for this number to go up. Because again, so it's not what the number is per se. The issue is why is this number less than that number? And so Böhm-Bawerk's point is talking about the productivity of stuff over here, and that's the end of your story. That has nothing to do with why this number is systematically less than that number. If anything, you would think that would explain why the price should go up higher. Okay, another way of seeing it is if, in one society or one period of time, the interest rate's 10%, and then somewhere else or at a different period it's 20%, you might say, okay, as an economist, explain to me why is it that the interest rate doubled. It wouldn't make sense to talk about the productivity of capital. That it's not true that, in the 20% society, that capital must be more physically productive. Because no, the productivity of the capital goods explains what their purchase price is. It's an entirely separate issue to say what's the relationship between that purchase price to the price, the expected price of the product when it comes off the line. Okay? Alright, so what is Böhm-Bawerk's solution then? So he blows up the naive productivity theory, and like I said, he goes through just a ton of them. if you're interested, on my Mises.org archives, I have a few, I think I did 3 of them, where I went through Böhm-Bawerk's, like the best of Böhm-Bawerk, right? Now available on DVD. And it's, and Böhm-Bawerk gone wild. And it's, right. Stuff the University of Vienna wouldn't let you see. All right. So it's, what they did there is, or what I do there, I took the best 3 things, like in terms of teaching an economics lesson, because it really is, he's a great teacher, a great economist, and the point is, if you go on my archives, I think it's probably not on the most recent page, but you'd have to go earlier, where I go through, and I think the titles, you'd be able to spot it just looking at the titles, where I go through the naive productivity theory and then 2 other ones. And one of them, I think, was the impatience theory. So somebody said, oh, well, interest is the return for waiting, or to you have to reward people because of impatience or something like that. But anyway, you'll see that it's his approach is brilliant, because he comes up with a great analysis, like comes up with a great scenario that really just drives home why, oh yeah, that theory doesn't make any sense. Okay, so then the question is, he goes through this whole book blowing up all these other theories. So what is his explanation for this apparent undervaluation? And he says it's the fact that present goods are preferred to future goods of comparable quality. And he says something like, that's the nub and kernel of the explanation that I'm going to give. Now this is a digression, so don't worry if you lose me here. There's a lot of controversy within Austrian circles, because what Böhm-Bawerk did, so this is his solution, right? That's the answer. But then he tried to take it further and say, now why is this true? And he offered 3 different causes for this. Okay, so, and then other Austrian, Mises himself thought that Böhm-Bawerk got mixed up himself. So that, in Human Action, if you read that part where Mises is talking about Böhm-Bawerk, he'll say, Böhm-Bawerk paved the way, his brilliant refutation of the productivity approach to interest, but then alas, Böhm-Bawerk in his own positive theory, his own explanation, returned to the crude productivity fallacies. All right, so that's what Mises says in Human Action. And what he means is, what he's referring to is the fact that when Böhm-Bawerk is laying out his own theory, he says, this is what it is, and we'll talk about this in a minute. This explains that undervaluation that I talked about, that solves the problem. But now as an economist, I can't just stop here. I'm going to give you explanations for why is this true. So if you just grant me that that's true, we've got the situation solved. Makes total sense. But let me tell you now why this is true. And one of the reasons Böhm-Bawerk gave, one of the contributing causes to why that statement is true, involved what he called the superior productivity of roundabout methods of production. All right, and you don't have to worry about that. That's a pretty technical issue, but my point is, so productivity was involved in one of his points as to why this is true. So that's why later Austrians thought Böhm-Bawerk kind of relapsed in the mistake. Okay, but for the lecture right now, let's just worry about, why is that, if that's true, if you grant me that that's true, why is it going to solve the interest theory? So let me first just remind you here. Okay, so subjectivist price theory says that a pound of steak has a higher price than a pound of hamburger, ultimately because consumers think that the steak has a higher marginal utility. Right, so that it's true, there's all sorts of other things going on. You have to worry about, how do you produce steak, how do you produce hamburger, if you want to sort of understand the big picture. But ultimately, when you go through the grocery store and you see people are paying a higher price for a pound of steak versus a pound of hamburger, as a subjectivist economist, you say, what's the reason? You say, because the steak has a higher marginal utility, right? Okay, so by the same token then, if people get more utility from a house available right now than they would from a claim on the same physical house that's not going to be available until next year, then the market price of the house right now is going to be higher. Okay? So it has nothing to do with ultimately, where those things come from or how you build them. But it's just if someone gives you a choice, someone gives you a choice on August 1st, 2009 and says, you can have a house right now, you can move in tomorrow, or I'll give you this airtight claim. So it's not an issue that you're worried that the claim's not going to be honored, right? That even if you're dead certain that with this IOU in your hand, you're going to get that same physical house available on August 1st, 2010, the issue is, and you say, okay, how much would you pay for these things? You would pay more for the house available right now. So out in the market, there's markets for these two things. The final market price of the house available right now is going to be $110,000, whereas maybe for the house, just the IOU, is going to be $100,000. Right? Just as steak in the marketplace commands a higher price than hamburger because it has a higher margin utility, same thing here. Okay? And so if you grant that, well, then we've solved the problem. Because what's happening is, back on this sheet, right here, the land, labor, and capital goods, those aren't really the house. They're just a technological claim on a house that's going to be available in 12 months. Right? And so it couldn't be that those would earn $110,000 because that would be paying $110,000 for a house that's not going to be available for 1 year. Right? So in a sense, this is like this IOU. Just it's like a technological claim, whereas the IOU is a contractual claim. Someone else is going to deliver you the house. In the terms of the physical production process, those inputs in a sense are a technological claim saying if you get these things, you know you will have a house 12 months from now. All right. So just to make sure you're seeing how this all ties together, the idea is if, let's say I have $100,000 to invest somewhere. If this is true, if this is what the market prices are right now, I can take my $100,000, buy an IOU, wait 12 months, and then as long as the market condition hasn't changed, my IOU in a sense ripens into a present good. Right? When I bought it, it was in a sense it was a future good. Right? It was a claim on a house that I wouldn't have available for another year, and then after the passage of time, it ripens into a present good, and then I can turn it in, get the house, and then sell it for $110,000. And so I've turned my $100,000 into $110,000. I've earned a 10% interest return. Okay, because I invested something in the time past. So what interest is in the Austrian approach? It's the income you earn from exchanging present goods for future goods. Okay, because people have what's called time preference. People prefer present goods to future goods. If you have command over present goods right now and you're willing to sell them off to exchange them for future goods, what will happen is you will end up with, once that future period turns into the present, you're going to have more present goods than you did originally. All right? And it doesn't have nothing to do with productivity directly. It has to do with the fact that people prefer present goods to future goods. Now, I'm not going to get into it. There's all sorts of cute philosophical issues there. Obviously, someone would prefer a future diamond to a present lump of coal, right? So when you say present goods are preferred to future goods, you mean holding other things constant, right? And you get into all sorts of cute things about, well, what if somebody how's it work? Somebody in the winter time, if I said, do you want an ice cream cone 3 months from now, or do you want it now? You might take it in the future because then you'd be getting it during the summer. Or if someone's going to give you fireworks now or on July 4th, you might say, well, don't give it to me now, give it to me. Okay, so you get issues like that, but obviously the point is with other economic laws that you'll hear in the Austrian school, the qualifiers are other things equal. Okay, all right, so that's Böhm-Bawerk's explanation, and like I said, I don't want to get into the reasons for that because there's a lot less unanimity. So Mises in Human Action says that time preference is true just because of the nature of action itself. So it's a priori true. If you just think through the implications of action, obviously there must be positive time preference. So again, positive time preference means just what I've been talking about, that present goods are preferred to future goods. Excuse me. Other Austrians like Israel Kirzner still thinks that time preference is the way you solve or you explain interest, but he is not committed to the a priori stuff. Kirzner just thinks it's an empirical regularity. People do have time preference maybe because of their biological needs, that you need to eat and stuff like that. So you have to have some consumption now. So Kirzner doesn't go for the a priori justification, whereas Mises thinks that, well, no, if you're going to have an economic law, you can't just refer to accidental things about biology or or physiology, that, it has to do with action. Just to give you an example, so in human action, Mises has a few different arguments for why time preference is a priori true. To give you one example of the argument, he says, how does he put it? He says, the very fact of action shows that you prefer, the end you're seeking sooner rather than later. That if you really were indifferent, you can imagine sort of, a being that lives forever, that's, perfectly, immortal and so forth. So there's no issue of, you have to consume now because of your physical body, right? So the idea is even if you try to give to the critic someone who says, hey, Mises, I don't think time preference is a necessary feature of action. Maybe it's just an empirical regularity. Mises can say, okay, well, let's imagine some actors, something that has a will and has ends, but there's no, it can delay 1,000 years if this actor wants, and nothing's going to change. And he says, even so, the fact that you do act shows that you want to achieve the end sooner rather than later. And he says, because look, suppose you could act now, but you delay a day. And he says, if you really held everything constant, well, when that day comes, if everything's constant and your preferences haven't changed, you would make the same decision, that you would delay a day, but then you would never consume. Right? So, like, if you've got something, a meal, and you're saying, should I consume it now or wait a day? Even if you held everything else constant, even if you have to worry about the meal deteriorating over time, Mises is saying, if you didn't, in a sense, have a tiebreaker that would always make you prefer to consume it sooner rather than later, well then, you can have a scenario where you would just keep delaying it forever. If there was nothing to sort of impel you to eat it sooner rather than later. And he said, but that's the same thing as saying you didn't value it. That if you have it sitting in front of you and you never choose to consume it, it must not be important to you. Alright, so I'm butchering a little bit, but that's the idea. Okay? So he's trying to show, again, that it's not just because people get hungry and they have to eat, but it's that the fact of action per se means people have time preference. And for the Austrians generally, time preference explains positive interest rates. Okay, let me, let's see. Roger Garrison wanted me to talk about the Hayekian triangle. Inside, just as a note, I've been talking to some of you and people are saying, gee, I wish, there was more interaction. Typically what happens to these things is because we're trying to pack so much into these lectures where you're all sitting in the same lecture room, we don't have time for questions at the end, but as the week progresses and we break up, usually what happens, partly because we just get worn out and we can't go a full hour, but, we'll, usually as the weeks go on, or as the week goes on, we'll go a shorter amount and then turn over for Q&A at the end, but right now I don't have enough time for that. Let me talk about the Hayekian triangle because Roger Garrison wanted me to mention it. So what happens just to give you a little context here, so Böhm-Bawerk's theory, we've seen that his explanation of interest has to do with the fact that present goods are more valuable than future goods. Now, the other main, or among his other things, what Böhm-Bawerk contributed was his idea of a society becoming more capitalistic. And in Böhm-Bawerk's framework, they had a very specific meaning. What he said in the translation, of course, is that the production techniques would become more roundabout. All right, and what he meant there, let me just give you a little bit of a background. So the idea was that you could try to achieve your ends by going directly after them, and that would yield a certain result, but that if you could wait, if you could delay your satisfaction, that you could usually find techniques of production, ways of using your resources to yield a greater amount of your ultimate consumption good, but of course that wouldn't accrue until a later date. All right, and so that was called adopting more roundabout processes. So to give you an example that Böhm-Bawerk I think used, so if you got somebody out in the woods and they have a cottage and there's a stream that's 50 yards away, and that's where they get their water from. And so obviously the good they want is water, and one way to do it, a very direct approach, given the resources the person has, he's got labor power, he could just go to the stream, cup his hands, and then, walk back to the kitchen. Like, let's say he wants to fill up a pot of water. Well, I guess he'd probably take the pot. That would be smarter. Let's say he has a pot of water that for some reason is stuck in his kitchen, and is under a fire. Okay, so he goes, he could clap his hands and go. Böhm-Bawerk didn't make that mistake. If you're writing a book, you can look ahead and realize, wait, this example's stupid. Okay, and so you could do it that way. And if you think about it, I mean, if you really needed to get water very quickly, that's the quickest thing you could do, right? But if you had more time, you could say, well, wait a minute, instead of me using my labor power to go to the river, cut my hands, and bring it back with, this much per trip, what I could do is I could go out and try to find a coconut, let's say. He's on an island somewhere, and I could take that coconut and split it open and hollow it out and then use that thing and go fill the coconut with the water and keep going back and forth that way. So you'd get more water per unit of your labor, but the first water wouldn't start hitting until, there was some delay. And then if you really had a lot of time, what you would do is you would go build yourself a shovel and a bunch of other things, and then dig a trench from your house to the stream and redirect it so that you had the water coming in, okay? And so that, you can imagine, might take you months to finish, but once you had done that, you'd have so much water coming in that if you then sat down and tried to figure out, okay, for as many labor hours as I put into it, how many quarts of water did I get per hour as a yield from this process, it would be a big number, okay? So that's what Böhm-Bawerk meant by a more roundabout process, that if you're building a shovel, you're finding a stick, and then you're trying to get a rock to attach to it that you're going to use as a shovel, and someone's saying, what are you doing? You're saying, oh, because I want to get water into my house. That seems crazy, right? Then what are you doing that for? You say, well, no, this is a very roundabout method of getting water into my house, because that's what he meant. Okay, actually, I lied. I'm not going to have time, so Garrison is on his own, but I bet he can explain the Hayekian triangle without my help, so I will stop there. Thanks.